So in this video, we're going to have a bit more of an in-depth look at the Boss ME-90 that I've been getting to grips with lately. So first thing is go to the Boss website, downloads page for the ME-90, download the system program version 1.3, because if you've got one already, it's probably come with version 1 on board. You need to update that first. Well, first thing you need to do is install the driver. Then you need to update the unit. Then you can use the Tone Studio and IR Loader apps on your Windows or Mac computer. So I've installed the driver. It's very straightforward. Now the system program, they got some pretty serious instructions to make sure you don't mess it up, because I think you can potentially brick your ME-90. So I've got mine here. Already I'm sort of making a critical error because I'm using the included batteries. So if the power dies while it's doing the update, you can brick it, but I'm going to take the risk. I haven't used the batteries for too long yet, so it should be okay. So if we want to check the version, turn the output level all the way down, hold down right and push the power switch, and it will tell us version 1, turn off the power. Now I've got it says micro USB cable, but it's pretty sure it's USB-C. That might have been carried over from the ME-80 or something like that, or another device. So we've got the update file. It's this one here. Drag it there to a folder of the exact same name. Okay, so that's got the text file and the bin file there. That's all you need. Hold down exit and right and push power. Message up appears. That's good. Connect the USB cable. Okay, that's good. It's showing the ME-90 as a drive. Now we can eject it. Blinking rapidly. That's what we want to see. Okay, that should be done now. Now the other thing that is quite useful, I recommend having a look at the parameter guide. So in this one, if you see here, it shows all the effects we can actually sub in to the unit. So we can get rid of S-bend, which isn't really that useful to a lot of people. We can get a Dynacomp, ring mod, or the poly octave. I think most people will go for that, so I'm probably going to make that swap. And the distortion, we can get rid of the big muff, which interestingly, Boss were allowed to misspell electro harmonics, but also use the words big muff. I don't know if they would have had to pay for that, but that's cool. So what do we want? OD1, governor, octave fuzz. I think I'm going to go for the governor first, and then maybe the fuzz face or the octave fuzz. In the modulation, we can get rid of overtone. Definitely going to go for the CE1. We'll give that a shot. I'm not too much of a fan of warp twist. We might try get rid of plus reverb, because you know you've got reverb on the unit, and we'll give glitch a shot, I guess. Chorus plus delay, don't really need it. It might be a nice modulated delay. We might give it a try another time. The preamps. So again, we can get rid of recti stack, boogie rectifier. Give one of these a go. Maybe the deluxe reverb perhaps, or the supreme amp. Great feeling crunch sound that responds to the nuances of your picking. This brings me to the other point I wanted to make in this video. This comes from the factory with the noise gate on, set to about midway. I can't remember if it was 20 or 25. I definitely recommend just turning that off, unless you're trying to play a genre that requires it. So in order to adjust this, hold down edit and bank. So that was on 20 from the factory. So I'm just going to turn it off. It does cut off the sustain a little bit, makes it sound a little bit weird, and you can lose a tiny bit of top end with it as well. So we can get rid of the 3-band EQ, which I don't actually find that useful anyway. All the amp EQ, the EQ, I'm pretty sure the frequency bands are the exact same for the amps as they are for the spare EQ. So unless you need to EQ the overdrive pedals and you're not using the preamp, it could be useful to get something else, because you can get a second harmonist or a second pitch shift in this section, so that then you can combine something from the mod section with, you know, something else that you might want. Rather, well, if you want 2 rotaries, you can do that, 2 univibes in series, but perhaps not as useful as, say, being able to use pitch shift with vibrato, for example. Also bearing in mind that this is sort of one way to adjust the order of effects. So if we go back up and have a look even though it is a bit of an odd thing that the only thing you can move in the signal chain is that just the order of the send return loop and the preamp. Because you can change the effect in EQ FX2 quite significantly, that does sort of allow you to not flip the order of these, but because you can use a pitch shift or a mod in either mode, you can kind of do it there. Also, you can have a delay here and a modulation or pitch shift here, so you can have delay before or after that. So the only thing it doesn't really let you do is put most of these effects before any of the distortion effects. Okay, the last thing I wanted to look at in the parameter guide, which is quite interesting, is, and this, you see this in a lot of Boss products and even older units, even as old as like the GX700 that I have, can change the output mode, drastically changes the sound. I thought that something was wrong with this when you take it from line to guitar or going to a guitar amp mode, so it disables the cab sim from the preamp. It sounded as if there was some really strange filter going on. It was set on tube combo 212 input, but that, to me, that's the worst sounding one. And I think many people will be contacting Boss or their retailer to say it sounds broken, because it sounds really odd plugged into any of the amp inputs or effects returns that I tried it with. So we'll experiment with that and find out which one is best, but you can significantly improve the sound. Unfortunately, you can't completely bypass the weird sort of frequency adjustment you get, but I guess they're trying to dial in the preamp section for different types of guitar amps. I suspect maybe they've done this so that they can make it sound really good with their own amps, which is why they have specific modes for a JC120 or a Boss Katana, as well as actual different models for the Katana 212 and the standard Katana 100 112. Okay, so here's how you change what you have loaded into the slot. Quite unfortunate that you can't really do this on the unit. Even if you could do some sort of menu diving to do it, I think it would be nice without having to, because it seems that those algorithms are on there, just not accessible unless you've got it plugged into a computer. So even if you had to menu dive, I think it would be handy if you could just make these changes yourself without having to connect to a computer. Now this is interesting, because if we get rid of the EQ, we don't have it duplicated here. Everything else we do. So is a bit of a compromise if you do that, but I think it might be nice to do pitch shift with vibrato, so I might do that. The other thing is, I'm not sure if writing this is going to actually change those adjustments for different patches or manual modes, so we're going to find out, but let's do that now. Okay, so as you can see that on a different patch, it hasn't done the substitution. So I've got to be on number 3 in order for it to activate any of those substitutions. If I go here, we get S-bend back there, we get the muff fuzz back there, and we get the EQ back there. It's not until I go here that we get the substitutions that we made. So anyway, let's have a listen, see what those sound like, as well as exploring the IR loader and the different output modes. So I'm just loading up an IR I made a week or so ago. It certainly takes quite a while to load a very small, sub 100 kilobyte file, but I think it does some sort of conversion process perhaps. So we've got that on user slot 1. Let's chuck another one on there. Don't know how we're going to change that when we're not connected to a computer, but we'll worry about that later. So just another little thing I wanted to have a look at, and this is really getting into the weeds, but I do think some of you are going to find it very useful. So we've got the ME-90 in line output mode, which means that it applies the cab sim when you have the preamp engaged. When you have the amp disengaged, it sounds the exact same whether you're in line or guitar output mode, guitar amp output mode. So when we engage that amp, so let's just show you the signal chain that we've got here. I've got Pro Tools with the signal generator outputting some pink noise, and we can have a look at what that looks like coming back out of the ME-90 using FabFilter Pro Q2. It's, it's flat enough just to see how the ME-90 responds. So if we go into Boss Tone Studio and we have a look at what is happening to the frequency response as we change different things, the first thing to have a look at is the amp. So let's engage that. So if we go to the output section here, when we're in line output mode, it doesn't let us actually change the AIRD output mode because it's not having any effect. Don't know why it doesn't allow us to change it. Anyway, if we just use the original, so speaker type, you can see the curve change completely. I have found that the transparent amp really is the most transparent. If you look at all the others, I was just trying to get a flat response amp, especially when we're using the pedals, so that it tends to get them to sound a bit better. Or you could just have the amp off, but then you're not going to have the impulse response if you're playing direct, so you almost have to use one of the preamps built in. So you can see how wild some of these frequency responses are. I mean, that's normal enough. You know, amps do change the frequency response of a guitar quite significantly. The problem I have with this is that if we switch over to guitar amp output mode, have a look at what happens to the shape of the signal. So we've got flat response with the amp off. If we engage the amp, that's just the sound of that amp. I've got low gain, it's on the transparent one. So it should be fairly flat, you would think, but it's definitely not there. It's not really doing any clipping, the EQ's in the middle, but you can see how aggressive some of the EQ changes are here between the different models. And I think that, you know, as much as we love Boss as guitarists, you know, they make some awesome products, they always have. But this is just one of those things that they do that I sometimes scratch my head at. Why can't you just get a kind of normal response rather than one of these pre-baked responses? I would love to just, because I feel like this is what makes the preamps sound kind of bad, especially if you connect any of them to a real guitar amp. They sound okay with the built-in impulse responses DI'd through studio monitors, but so far I haven't been able to get a very good distortion sound plugged into a guitar amp. With the pedals, they sound fine because you've got the preamp disabled. So I am going to have a listen after this to probably one of, I think it was 412 return. Looks to be kind of normal, I guess. I'll check what amp I've got engaged. So we're on transparent. Gain's only at 2. I mean, I think that, yeah, the level doesn't change the frequency response on these, so that's good. I mean, if I bring the gain up and the level down, it will probably be basically the same on this one. It's not really clipping too much. So you can see when you go amp input, it does apply these kind of quite aggressive cuts at about 5K or boosts around 15K. Look at that. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just to do with the clipping, but I've really reduced the output level going into the ME-90 now. So I think Katana 100 212 return looks to be the flattest. And we can try that with a different amp engaged perhaps. Let's go deluxe combo. Let's make sure the speakers stay the same. Yep. So yeah, it's got the, you know, the deluxe combo frequency response, I guess, or what they determined it to be. So it might also depend on which amp model you're using as to which one of these sounds the best to you. But yeah, I think I'm going to keep it on Katana 100 return for now. Let's go back to transparent. Those two look fairly similar anyway, so I think I'm going to keep it on that. So yeah, my main gripe there is that you can't disengage the cab sim from the amp if you're in line output mode or, you know, direct mode. And if you're in guitar amp mode, you seemingly can't disable this sort of inverse cab sim thing that they have going on either. Even my old GX700, at least you can use the amp models. The amp models sound great when you run them into modern impulse responses. And I'm sure that these are capable of sounding pretty good as well. But because you either have to use baked in impulses or what seems to be some weird process they add to impulses you load onto it, you're a little bit limited in that regard. So I'm going to work on it a bit more, see if I can get the ones I load on there to sound a bit better. I'm willing to admit that this could be user error, at least with the impulses at this stage, but it definitely seems that it's a little bit disappointing with the output modes sounds, as I've tried to explain here. So I think I've now managed to wrap my head around what is going on with the amp sims in the ME-90 when you're connecting to a guitar amp. I did have some comments in the previous video about demonstrating it into a real amp rather than direct. I guess a lot of people, especially when you hear a direct signal outside of a mix, it tends to sound its worst. When you hear it in a mix, it often sounds just fine, because we're so, as you know, if we're not a recording engineer, we're definitely not as used to hearing mic'd up or mic'd up-esque sounds compared to amp in the room sounds. So it has been interesting trying to get the amp sims sounding good with a real amp. I'm plugged into my Peavey 6505 and we're just going to explore this just a little bit. And what I found so far has been kind of interesting. So I've got the amp mic'd up with a ribbon mic and an SM57. The MD421's not in use, so kind of a classic combination, and it sounds just like this. And if we want to engage the ME-90, just check the noise gates on here. We take it all the way out just so it's the same. We can boost it a bit. Or we can use like a tube screamer. So now I'll switch the amp over to the clean channel, just to explore the exact same mic setup on the same cab, but getting the dirt from the ME-90 instead. The first thing to demonstrate is if we just use, say, the DS1, I think we can get a half decent sound out of that. Try some of the others. Blues drive is pretty good. If we jump on over to Tone Studio, so we're on guitar amp mode, but it seems to apply this kind of impulse response no matter what you do. For example, so that's set to original, but if I change what you would think is the IR, which you would think would only affect the DI line out mode, it's still changing it quite drastically for the guitar amp input mode. However, obviously this is only when we have one of the preamps engaged. So we'll chuck a preamp on. Let's go with Brit Stack. Quite a bit of gain. Sounds pretty bad. You can hear how much these adjusted. Bearing in mind, I'm not plugged into the effects return. So what I've actually tried to do is, instead of loading an impulse response, I've just deconvolved a sine sweep that you'd normally use to make an impulse response to try and get a completely flat output here. It hasn't really worked. It's kind of gotten an interesting result, but it hasn't fully worked. But I think some of them you can make it sound better this way. So these were just basically flat. The third one I just rolled off a bit of high end. Okay, I can understand that if you're using a real guitar amp, you don't really need to use an amp model, but it still would be nice if you could use them, you know, just as distortion pedals, without this kind of hollow, whistly sounding cab sim that you cannot take off. You have to select one of these, and then original mode is what's baked into them, or you can try and trick it with your own flat impulse response. But as you heard, it doesn't really help it all that much. If I turn the amp off and just use a distorted pedal, it sounds significantly better to me. At least it just sounds natural. The character of the clipping is not spectacular, but it doesn't sound like it has a cab sim going through another cab, or as though there's some sort of phasey kind of half digital signal, half analog going through the pedal. But I couldn't see, I've had this with Boss Gear before where you find that there's a drive-through enabled, but I can't see that anywhere in the system settings. Funny enough, the Tube Combo 212 input seems to be the worst sounding of those to me, and that's the one I'm pretty sure that it comes set to from the factory. I think Katana 100 212 is the most passable of those. I'm probably getting a little bit of additional noise just from having the USB plugged in at the same time, so I will just write this and we'll unplug it. Someone did ask in the previous video if we could take a look at the current draw of the device when there's more things enabled other than just switching it on, just to check. Boss say that it's up to 190 milliamps, so perhaps that's correct. So it's still pretty much the same. If we go to manual mode and turn everything on. So yeah, I guess you could say up to 115 milliamps. Turn the output all the way up. Maybe make it oscillate or something. Yeah, I guess you can get up to 120. Maybe get the delay feeding back. So overall, I think it's a pretty cool device, other than my gripes with the cab sim stuff. But even though it's not the biggest issue, because, and I think Boss might have thought about this, you're not likely to use a preamp with a guitar amp. You're more likely to use the pedals, which sound pretty good. So the whole thing's real easy to dial in. It's easy to understand. It's compact. Plenty of effects you might not care to own as individual pedals, but then you can just have them in this for when you might need them. So they're useful on occasion. And it's got, it's pretty decent sound quality, and it's good enough for what you're trying to do. In terms of cons, I guess sometimes, the colors and the graphics of individual pedals can make them a lot faster and easier to work with. Particularly if your mind is occupied, singing, playing guitar on stage, or songwriting, recording, you might not want to have something where you've got to read text to know what you're doing when you're adjusting. And even though this is about as simple as it gets for a multi-effects pedal. Build quality, I've seen people complaining about it. It feels solid, honestly. This top panel, I'm pretty sure that is a piece of sheet metal and the rest of it is plastic, but it's not 100% plastic. I wouldn't say it's a huge improvement over the ME-80. Especially considering other brands that have probably surpassed it in terms of sound quality, especially with the fuzz and distortion effects, such as the Line 6 HX effects or HX Stomp, or possibly the Nuix or Nux Trident. I think that's going to sound a bit better, but I don't know for sure. I haven't tried it. Anyway, the main selling point of the ME-90 is that you've got real pots rather than infinite encoders, so it's so much faster to adjust parameters. So I think this sort of unit is for someone who wants something simple and easy to dial in and wants a bunch of effects in one unit. It's very good for that. I do think it's odd that you can't just completely tweak the order of everything, but some of the adjustability of what you can have in the mod and EQ FX2 modes does allow you to make, you know, a decent range of adjustments, but still weird that you can't really put distortion after any of these effects. And you can't put a distortion in the substitutable modes in either of these. You know, if you want like phaser or flanger before distortion. I think it's a shame that you can't power it off the USB port. I've tried it. The thing only runs on about 1 watt of power, and that would easily be accomplished by the USB, but I guess it does make it noisier when you're using that, so they just didn't want to have people trying to do that and then complaining about noise. I can understand that. So yeah, some pedals are great for writing riffs and songs, but others like this, I would say, are better for covering songs, learning riffs, because you can get the sound you're after really quickly. That's its primary use case, in my opinion, along with being, you know, a fairly affordable jack of all trades unit. So thanks for watching this far. I hope most of that made sense. Let me know if you can get some good sounds out of the preamps through a guitar amp, or alternatively, maybe you get some good sounds from the preamps running direct into impulse responses in your PC. Any comments, leave them below, and I'll definitely be doing more videos on this, as well as comparing it to a few other Boss pedals, mostly the DD200 and the PS5, as well as a few other non-Boss pedals. And let me know if there's anything else you want covered in those future videos. Thanks.